The gunshot that killed Frank Sullivan's brother echoed in his mind every single day for 3 years, and in all that time, not once had his lips curved into anything resembling a smile. He stood at the bar in Agua Caliente, Arizona, in the summer of 1882, nursing a whiskey he barely tasted, his eyes fixed on nothing in particular as the saloon buzzed with life around him. The desert town sat nestled in the Southern Territory, where the heat baked the earth until it cracked, and the nights brought relief that felt like a benediction. Frank had drifted here 6 months ago, taking work at the Patterson Ranch just outside town, keeping his head down and his mouth shut, speaking only when absolutely necessary. The other ranch hands had learned quickly that Frank Sullivan was not a man who engaged in idle chatter or shared stories around the campfire. He worked harder than any 2 men combined, breaking horses with a patience that seemed endless, mending fences under the brutal sun without complaint, and disappeared into his solitary existence each night without fanfare. Clara Thompson had arrived in Agua Caliente 3 weeks earlier on the afternoon stage, her auburn hair pinned beneath a sensible traveling hat, her green eyes taking in the dusty Main Street with a mixture of hope and trepidation. She was 22 years old, newly hired as the schoolteacher for the town's modest schoolhouse, and determined to make a fresh start after losing her parents to influenza back in Missouri. The townspeople had welcomed her warmly, particularly the women who were desperate for an educated young lady to teach their children proper reading, writing, and arithmetic. Clara had rented a small room above the general store, spending her evenings preparing lessons and her mornings getting to know the families whose children would soon fill her classroom. She possessed a natural warmth that drew people to her, an easy laugh that seemed to brighten even the dreariest situations, and an irrepressible optimism that refused to be dampened by the harsh realities of frontier life. Their first encounter happened on a Saturday afternoon when Clara walked into the saloon, which also served as the town's informal gathering place and restaurant during daylight hours. She needed to speak with Tom Patterson about his children's enrollment, and someone had mentioned he often stopped by for lunch. Frank sat alone at a corner table, mechanically eating a plate of beans and cornbread, when Clara swept in with an energy that seemed to shift the very air in the room. She spotted Patterson at the bar and approached him with a bright smile, discussing attendance and supplies with an enthusiasm that made the grizzled rancher chuckle despite himself. Frank found himself watching her without meaning to, noting the way her hands moved expressively as she spoke, the genuine interest she showed when Patterson mentioned his youngest daughter's fear of attending school. When their business concluded, Clara turned to survey the room, likely looking for a place to sit and have her own meal. The saloon was crowded, every table occupied except for the empty chair across from Frank. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and before Frank could look away, she was heading directly toward him. "Excuse me," Clara said, her voice carrying a musical quality that seemed entirely out of place in the rough surroundings. "Would you mind terribly if I sat here? Everywhere else seems to be taken, and I am absolutely famished." Frank gave a curt nod, his jaw tight, his eyes already returning to his plate. Most people would have taken the hint, recognized the walls he had constructed around himself, and maintained a respectful silence. Clara Thompson was not most people. "I am Clara Thompson, the new schoolteacher," she said, settling into the chair and placing her small handbag on the table. "I arrived 3 weeks ago from Missouri, and I must say, the heat here takes some getting used to. Though I suppose you are well accustomed to it by now." Frank said nothing, continuing to eat with deliberate focus. Clara seemed unbothered by his silence, signaling to the barkeeper for a meal of her own. I understand there are about 30 children of school age in Agua Caliente and the surrounding ranches, she continued conversationally. I am hoping to start classes next week, once I have all the supplies properly organized. Do you have children who will be attending? No, Frank said, the single word coming out rougher than he intended. I see, Clara said, not deterred in the slightest. Well, education is important for the whole community, I believe. Even those without children benefit from having well-educated young people growing up around them. The barkeeper brought Clara a plate of stew and fresh bread, and she thanked him warmly before turning her attention back to her meal. For a few blessed moments, Frank thought she might eat in silence, but then she spoke again. You know, I once had a student back in Missouri who refused to speak for an entire month, Clara said, her tone light and conversational. Turned out he had witnessed something traumatic, and words just seemed to have left him entirely. But eventually, with patience and time, he began to open up again. Sometimes silence is a shield, I think. Frank's fork paused halfway to his mouth, his eyes lifting to meet hers with an intensity that would have made most people flinch. Clara simply looked back at him with those clear green eyes, no judgment in them, just a gentle understanding that made something twist uncomfortably in his chest. I am not one of your students, Frank said flatly. No, of course not, Clara agreed easily. I was simply making an observation. I do apologize if I have overstepped. I have been told I have a terrible habit of talking too much, especially when I am nervous about something. Despite himself, Frank found his curiosity piqued. What are you nervous about? Clara's smile was self-deprecating as she broke off a piece of bread. Starting a new position in a new town where I know absolutely no one, hoping that I will be adequate to the task, wondering if the children will respect me, or if I will make a complete fool of myself on the first day. The usual sorts of things, I suppose. There was such honest vulnerability in her admission that Frank felt his rigid posture soften slightly. You will do fine, he heard himself say, surprising them both. Clara's face lit up with genuine pleasure at his words. Thank you. That is very kind of you to say. I do not believe I caught your name, Frank. Frank Sullivan. It is a pleasure to meet you, Frank Sullivan, Clara said, extending her hand across the table in a gesture that was bold for a proper young lady but somehow suited her perfectly. Frank stared at her hand for a long moment before his own rough, calloused hand reached out to grasp it briefly. The touch was fleeting, but it was the most human contact he had initiated in months, and it left him feeling oddly unsettled. They finished their meals without much additional conversation, but as Clara stood to leave, she paused by the table. I expect I will be seeing you around town, Mr. Sullivan. Agua Caliente is not so large that we can avoid one another entirely. Frank watched her leave, that uncomfortable twist in his chest returning, and he drained the rest of his whiskey in one gulp, trying to drown the unfamiliar feeling. Over the following weeks, Frank found that Clara had been entirely correct. Agua Caliente was indeed small enough that their paths crossed with surprising frequency. He would see her in the general store, carefully selecting supplies for her classroom with a budget that was clearly limited. He would pass the schoolhouse on his way back to the ranch, and hear her voice drifting through the open windows, as she led the children in their lessons with patience and creativity. And somehow, despite his best efforts to avoid social situations, he kept finding himself in places where Clara Thompson happened to be. The woman seemed to possess a gravitational pull that drew people to her. Frank observed from a distance, as she organized a spelling bee that had the entire town turning out to watch, as she gently encouraged the shyest students to participate in recitations, as she spent her own money to buy books for children whose families could not afford them. She was kind without being condescending, firm without being harsh, and she possessed an infectious joy that seemed to touch everyone around her. Everyone, except Frank Sullivan, who remained locked in his self-imposed isolation, wrapped in the grief and guilt that had defined him since that terrible day 3 years ago. It was a Tuesday evening in late September when everything began to shift. Frank had ridden into town to pick up some supplies for the ranch, and darkness had fallen by the time he finished loading his saddlebags. He was leading his horse down the main street when he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. A woman's voice, sharp with fear. He moved without thinking, his hand going to the pistol at his hip as he rounded the corner of the livery stable. In the shadows, he could make out two figures. Clara Thompson pressed against the stable wall, and a man Frank recognized as Ned Whitmore, a drifter who had been causing trouble in town for the past few days. "Come on now, schoolteacher," Whitmore was saying, his words slurred with drink. "Just one little kiss. Ain't no harm in that." "Mr. Whitmore, I must insist that you step away," Clara said, her voice admirably steady despite the fear Frank could see in her eyes. "You are intoxicated, and you are going to do something you will regret." "Only thing I am going to regret is if you do not stop being so unfriendly," Whitmore growled, reaching for her arm. "That is enough," Frank said, his voice cutting through the darkness like a blade. Whitmore spun around, nearly losing his balance in his drunken state. "This does not concern you, Sullivan. Mind your own business." Frank moved closer, his hand still resting on his pistol. "The lady told you to step away. I suggest you listen." For a moment, it seemed like Whitmore might be foolish enough to push the issue, but something in Frank's eyes must have communicated the seriousness of the situation. Whitmore muttered a curse and stumbled off into the darkness, leaving Frank and Clara alone in the shadows. Clara released a shaky breath, her hand pressed to her chest. "Thank you, Mr. Sullivan. I am not certain what would have happened if you had not come along when you did." "Are you hurt?" Frank asked, his voice gruff with an emotion he did not want to examine too closely. "No, just shaken," Clara admitted. "I should not have been walking alone after dark. It was foolish of me." "You should not have to worry about being attacked in your own town," Frank said firmly. "Come on, I will walk you back to your room." They walked in silence for a few moments, Frank leading his horse with one hand while staying close enough to Clara to be protective. The moon was rising over the desert, painting everything in silver light, and the temperature had dropped to something almost comfortable after the brutal heat of the day. "You are a man of few words, Mr. Sullivan," Clara said finally, her equilibrium apparently restored by the familiar comfort of conversation. "But your actions speak quite loudly." Frank said nothing, but he glanced at her from the corner of his eye. "I have been observing you, you know," Clara continued. "Not in any improper way, of course, but I am naturally curious about people, and you present quite the puzzle." "I am not a puzzle," Frank said flatly, "just a man who prefers to keep to himself." "Perhaps," Clara allowed. "But I cannot help but wonder what would make someone so deliberately shut themselves off from the world. It seems like a terribly lonely way to live." They had reached the general store, and Frank stopped at the base of the exterior stairs that led to Clara's room. He looked at her properly then, taking in the curiosity and concern in her eyes, and felt that uncomfortable twist in his chest again. "Loneliness is safer than the alternative," Frank said quietly. "What alternative would that be?" Clara asked, her voice equally soft. "Caring about people who can be taken from you," Frank said, the words coming out before he could stop them. Understanding dawned in Clara's eyes, followed by a compassion that made Frank want to retreat immediately. But she did not offer platitudes or empty sympathy. Instead, she simply said, "Thank you again for your help tonight, Mr. Sullivan. I hope we might speak again soon under better circumstances." She climbed the stairs and disappeared into her room, leaving Frank standing in the street with his horse, wondering why he felt like something had just shifted fundamentally in his carefully ordered world. After that night, Frank found himself increasingly unable to avoid Clara Thompson, and worse, increasingly unwilling to do so. She began to greet him warmly whenever their paths crossed, always with a smile and a friendly word that never demanded more from him than he was willing to give. She did not pry into his past or push him to engage beyond his comfort level, but her presence in his life became a constant, gentle pressure against the walls he had built around himself. October brought cooler temperatures and preparations for the town's harvest celebration, a modest affair where families would gather to share food and mark the changing of the seasons. Frank typically avoided such events, but this year he found himself agreeing when Tom Patterson asked if he would help set up tables and chairs in the town square. He told himself it was simply because Patterson had been a fair employer, but he knew the truth was more complicated than that. Clara was everywhere during the celebration, helping organize games for the children, serving food to the elderly residents, laughing and talking with everyone who crossed her path. Frank kept to the periphery, helping where needed but avoiding the center of the festivities. He was hauling another load of firewood for the communal bonfire when he nearly collided with Clara, who was carrying a heavy basket of apples. "Mr. Sullivan," she exclaimed, her face flushed from exertion and enjoyment. "I did not expect to see you here, though I am very glad you came." "Just helping Patterson with the setup," Frank mumbled, very aware of how close they were standing. "Well, since you are here, perhaps you might help me with something," Clara said, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "I have been tasked with organizing the children for a game of hide and seek, but I confess I am running out of enthusiasm for chasing after 30 young ones. Would you be willing to serve as the seeker? You have a much more authoritative presence than I do." "I do not think that is a good idea," Frank said, already starting to edge away. "Please," Clara asked, and there was something in her voice beyond simple cajoling. "The children would be thrilled to have someone new involved, and honestly, I could use the help." Frank found himself agreeing despite every instinct telling him to refuse. Within minutes, he was standing in the center of the town square, his eyes covered, counting to 50 while children scattered in every direction with gleeful shrieks. When he opened his eyes and began to search, he could hear Clara's laughter ringing out as she watched the proceedings, and despite himself, he felt the corner of his mouth twitch in something that was almost, but not quite, a smile. He found the children one by one, his sharp eyes spotting them in their various hiding places behind barrels and water troughs and buildings. They shrieked with delight when he discovered them, and the smallest ones begged him to seek again. Frank found himself agreeing to a second round, then a third, until the sun began to set and parents called their children to the communal meal. Clara appeared at his elbow as the game wound down, slightly breathless from laughing. "You were wonderful with them, Mr. Sullivan. You should have seen little Daniel Patterson's face when you found him behind the smithy. He was convinced his hiding spot was perfect." "They are good children," Frank said, surprised to find he meant it. "They are indeed," Clara agreed. "And you, sir, are a good man, whether you wish to admit it or not." Before Frank could respond, she was called away to help serve the meal, leaving him standing there with a strange warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the bonfire blazing nearby. As autumn deepened into winter, Frank found his interactions with Clara increasing in frequency and duration. She had taken to visiting the general store on Saturday afternoons, the same time Frank typically came to town for supplies, and they would often end up talking while browsing the shelves. Their conversations ranged from the mundane to the surprisingly personal, with Clara sharing stories of her childhood in Missouri and her dreams for her students, while Frank found himself gradually opening up about his work at the ranch, and, eventually, small details about his life before Agua Caliente. It was during one of these Saturday encounters in early December that Clara told the joke that would change everything. They were standing near the store's pot-bellied stove, seeking warmth from the unseasonably cold day, when Clara suddenly laughed at something she had apparently just remembered. "What?" Frank asked, surprised at his own curiosity. "I just recalled something one of my students said yesterday," Clara explained, her eyes bright with amusement. "We were discussing occupations, and I asked them what their parents did for work." Little Mary Hutchinson raised her hand very seriously and announced that her father was a banker. Then Tommy Chen, who sits next to her, piped up and said his father was a rancher. Mary looked at him very solemnly and said, "Well, my father is much cleaner than yours." Clara paused for effect, then continued. And Tommy, without missing a beat, replied, "Maybe so, but my father is more outstanding in his field." It took Frank a moment to process the play on words, and then something extraordinary happened. A sound emerged from deep in his chest, rusty and unfamiliar, like a mechanism that had not been used in years finally creaking back to life. He was laughing. Actually laughing, a genuine burst of amusement that surprised him more than anyone. Clara's face transformed with wonder and delight, her smile so radiant it seemed to illuminate the entire store. "You laughed," she said softly, as if witnessing a miracle. Frank felt his face flush, suddenly self-conscious. The laughter died as quickly as it had come, but something fundamental had shifted inside him. For a brief moment, he had remembered what joy felt like, had touched that part of himself he thought had died along with his brother 3 years ago. The sensation was both exhilarating and terrifying. "I should go," Frank said abruptly, grabbing his supplies and heading for the door. "Frank, wait," Clara called after him, but he was already gone, fleeing into the cold December afternoon as if pursued by demons. He rode hard back to the ranch, his mind in turmoil. That single moment of laughter had cracked something open inside him, something he had kept carefully sealed and buried. With it came a flood of memories. His brother Jacob's easy smile, the sound of their mother singing while she cooked, the feeling of belonging to something larger than himself. But also the pain, the gunshot, Jacob's blood staining the dirt, the emptiness that followed, and underneath it all, a new and equally terrifying realization. He was developing feelings for Clara Thompson that went far beyond simple friendship or gratitude. Frank threw himself into work over the following week, taking every difficult job Patterson could assign, staying out on the range until darkness forced him back, exhausting himself so thoroughly that he collapsed into dreamless sleep each night. He avoided town, sending one of the other ranch hands to pick up supplies, and tried to convince himself that the distance would make the unfamiliar feelings fade. But on the 7th day, Clara Thompson rode out to the Patterson ranch on a borrowed horse, her expression determined as she asked the foreman where she might find Frank Sullivan. Frank was mending fence in the north pasture when he saw her approaching, and his first instinct was to mount his horse and ride in the opposite direction. But something kept him rooted in place, watching as she guided her horse carefully across the rough terrain, her posture in the saddle suggesting she was not an experienced rider, but was managing through sheer determination. "Mr. Sullivan," Clara said when she reached him, dismounting with only slight awkwardness, "you have been avoiding me." There seemed little point in denying the obvious. "Yes, may I ask why?" Clara inquired, tying her borrowed horse to the fence post. "You know why," Frank said, returning his attention to the fence, as if focusing on the work might make this conversation less difficult. "I am afraid I do not," Clara said, moving closer. "Unless you are running away because for one moment you allowed yourself to feel something other than pain and grief, and that terrifies you." Frank's hand stilled on the wire. "You do not understand." "Then explain it to me," Clara challenged, her voice gentle but insistent. "Talk to me, Frank. Tell me what happened that made you lock yourself away from the world." For a long moment, Frank said nothing. The desert wind whispered through the sparse grass, and somewhere in the distance cattle lowed. Then, slowly, the words began to come. "3 years ago, my brother Jacob and I were working a ranch in New Mexico," Frank said, his voice rough with emotion. "We had plans to save up enough money to buy our own place, build something together. Jacob was younger than me by 2 years, always laughing, always seeing the bright side of things. He was good with people in a way I never was." Clara listened silently, not interrupting, giving him the space to continue. "One night we were in town at a saloon, just having a drink, minding our own business. An argument broke out between some drifters and a local rancher over a card game. It had nothing to do with us, but Jacob being Jacob, he tried to step in and calm things down. He always thought he could make peace, could find the words to settle any dispute." Frank's jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on some distant point only he could see. "One of the drifters pulled a gun. Jacob tried to get between them, tried to stop it. The gun went off. Jacob died in my arms before the doctor could even arrive." "Oh, Frank," Clara breathed, her hand moving to his arm in a gesture of comfort. "I should have stopped him," Frank continued, the words pouring out now like water through a broken dam. "I should have held him back, should have been the one to step in. But I just sat there, and by the time I realized what was happening, it was too late. He died because I did not act, because I failed to protect him." "It was not your fault," Clara said firmly. "You cannot blame yourself for the random violence of others." "I am his older brother," Frank said, his voice breaking. "I was supposed to take care of him." "And I am certain you did, for his entire life," Clara said. "Frank, look at me." Reluctantly, Frank turned to face her, and was shocked to see tears streaming down her cheeks even as her expression remained strong and compassionate. "Grief is not something we get over," Clara said. "It is something we learn to carry. But you are not honoring your brother's memory by shutting yourself off from life. You are just ensuring that the tragedy that took him also takes you, in a different way." "I do not know how to do anything else," Frank admitted, the confession costing him dearly. "I do not know how to let people in anymore. What if I care about someone and they are taken too? What if I am not enough to keep them safe?" "You cannot control the world, Frank," Clara said gently. "You cannot prevent every tragedy or protect everyone you love from every harm. All you can do is choose to live fully in the time you have, to love deeply despite the risks, and to honor those you have lost by finding joy again." She stepped closer, close enough that Frank could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes. "When you laughed last week, just for that moment, I saw the man you used to be. I saw the man you could be again if you would let yourself. And Frank, that man is someone truly wonderful." "Clara, Frank started, then stopped, unsure of what to say, how to put into words the tangle of emotions inside him. "You do not have to say anything right now," Clara said. "I just needed you to know that I am not going anywhere. I am not afraid of your grief or your silence or your walls. I see you, Frank Sullivan, all of you, and I am not running away." With that, she squeezed his arm gently, then walked back to her horse. Frank watched her ride away, his heart pounding, feeling as if he were standing on the edge of a precipice, about to make a choice that would define the rest of his life. That night, Frank could not sleep. He lay in his bunk in the ranch house, staring at the ceiling, Clara's words echoing in his mind. For 3 years, he had told himself that isolation was the answer, that if he did not let anyone close, he could not be hurt again. But what kind of life was that, really? What would Jacob think if he could see his brother now, going through the motions of existence without truly living? Jacob had loved life with an enthusiasm that Frank had always envied. He had found joy in small things: a perfectly cooked meal, a well-trained horse, a clear starlit night. He had believed that people were fundamentally good, that kindness mattered, that connection was what made life worth living. And Frank had let his brother's death extinguish all of those beliefs, as if by refusing to embrace them, he was somehow staying loyal to Jacob's memory. But maybe Clara was right. Maybe the best way to honor Jacob was not to die alongside him, but to live the kind of full, open-hearted life that Jacob had valued. Maybe it was time to step off the precipice and trust that something would be there to catch him. The next morning, Frank asked Patterson for the day off, something he had never done in the 6 months he had worked at the ranch. Then he rode into Agua Caliente, his heart hammering in his chest, his palms sweating despite the cool December air. He found Clara just as school was dismissing for the day, and he waited outside the schoolhouse as children streamed past him with curious looks. When Clara emerged, her arms full of books and papers, she stopped short at the sight of him. "Frank, what are you doing here?" "I have been thinking about what you said," Frank began, then paused, suddenly uncertain. The words he had practiced during the ride into town seemed to have evaporated from his mind. Clara set down her books on the schoolhouse steps and gave him her full attention, her expression open and patient. "I have been thinking about what you said," Frank started again, "about how grief is something we carry, not something we get over, about choosing to live fully despite the risks." He took a breath, forcing himself to continue. "You were right, about all of it. I have been so focused on protecting myself from more pain that I forgot how to feel anything else. But then you came along with your questions and your stories and your terrible jokes." A smile tugged at Clara's lips at that, and the sight of it gave Frank courage to continue. "And for the first time in 3 years, I laughed. I felt something other than grief and guilt, and it scared me because it felt like a betrayal of Jacob, like I did not have the right to experience joy when he never would again." "But you do have that right," Clara said softly. "I know that now," Frank said. "Or at least, I am beginning to understand it. You helped me see that. And Clara, I need you to know that what I feel for you, it is more than gratitude. It is more than friendship. You have awakened something in me that I thought was dead, and I am terrified, but I am also willing to try. If you will have me, if I am not too broken or too closed off." Clara's eyes shimmered with tears as she closed the distance between them. "Frank Sullivan, you are not broken. You are healing, which is entirely different. And yes, I will absolutely have you in whatever way you are able to give of yourself." Frank reached out with a trembling hand and cupped her cheek, marveling at the softness of her skin, the warmth of her beneath his palm. "I do not know how to do this anymore, how to court someone properly, how to be what you deserve." "Then we will figure it out together," Clara said, covering his hand with her own. "I do not need grand gestures or perfect words, Frank. I just need you, honest and present and willing to try." Frank leaned down slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, but Clara rose up to meet him halfway. Their lips met in a kiss that was gentle and tentative and filled with promise, the kind of kiss that marked the beginning of something new and precious. When they finally pulled apart, Frank rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed, feeling more at peace than he had in 3 long years. "Thank you," he whispered, "for not giving up on me, for seeing something in me worth saving." "You saved yourself, Frank," Clara said. "I just reminded you that you could." The following months were a revelation for Frank Sullivan. Courting Clara was nothing like he had expected, primarily because she refused to let him treat her like some delicate flower that needed protection from every harsh wind. She was practical and strong-willed, with opinions on everything from education policy to water rights, and she expected Frank to engage with her as an equal partner, not simply as a suitor paying homage to a lady. They fell into a comfortable rhythm of spending time together whenever Frank's work schedule allowed. He would ride into town on Sundays after church, which he had started attending again at Clara's gentle encouragement, and they would take long walks through the desert surrounding Agua Caliente. Clara would point out different plants and animals, sharing the knowledge she had gained from books, while Frank would explain the more practical aspects of surviving in the harsh landscape. They talked about everything during those walks. Clara shared her dreams of expanding the school, of creating a library for the town, of perhaps one day writing a book about her experiences teaching on the frontier. Frank found himself opening up about his childhood, his relationship with Jacob, and slowly, painfully, he began to share the good memories instead of just the tragic end. He told Clara about the time Jacob had tried to break a particularly stubborn horse and ended up in a water trough, about their mother's legendary temper when they tracked mud through her clean kitchen, about their father's quiet pride when they successfully delivered their first calf. With each memory shared, Frank felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. He began to understand that remembering Jacob with joy and laughter was not a betrayal but a celebration, a way of keeping his brother's spirit alive in the world. Winter gave way to spring, and with it came new life to the desert. Wildflowers bloomed in impossible profusions of color, and the temperature began its steady climb toward the brutal heat of summer. Frank and Clara's relationship deepened alongside the changing seasons, growing from tentative new beginnings into something solid and enduring. In April, Frank asked Patterson if he might have a private word with the rancher. They sat in Patterson's office, and Frank laid out his situation. He had been saving his wages carefully, and he had enough now to make a down payment on a small piece of land just outside town. There was a modest house on the property, nothing fancy, but solid and well built. He wanted to buy it, to put down roots in Agua Caliente, to build a future. But more than that, he wanted to know if Patterson would write him a letter of character reference, as he intended to ask Clara to marry him, and wanted to be able to demonstrate that he was a man of good standing in the community. Patterson had agreed immediately, clapping Frank on the shoulder with genuine warmth. "About time you started living again, Sullivan. Clara Thompson is a fine woman and you are a good man. You will make each other happy, I have no doubt." With the land purchased and the house being cleaned and repaired during his spare hours, Frank knew it was time to take the final step. On a warm evening in late April, as the sun painted the desert in shades of gold and crimson, he asked Clara to take a ride with him. They traveled to his newly acquired property, and Frank helped Clara down from her horse, his hands lingering at her waist. "Why have you brought me here?" Clara asked, looking around at the small adobe house and the surrounding land with curiosity. "Because this is ours if you want it," Frank said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know I should probably do this more formally, should get down on one knee and make a pretty speech, but I am not good with words like you are, Clara. So I am just going to say it plain. I love you. I love your laugh and your kindness and your terrible jokes and the way you see good in everyone. even in broken cowboys who have forgotten how to smile. You brought me back to life when I thought I was beyond saving, and I want to spend the rest of my days making you as happy as you have made me. Clara Thompson, will you marry me? Clara's hands flew to her mouth, tears streaming down her face even as she laughed with joy. Yes, yes, of course I will marry you, Frank Sullivan. Nothing would make me happier. Frank pulled a simple gold band from his pocket, one he had purchased from the jeweler in town with nearly all of his remaining savings. It was not fancy or elaborate, but it was real gold and made with care, and when he slid it onto Clara's finger, it fit perfectly. They were married in June, on a Saturday afternoon in Agua Caliente's small church, with what seemed like the entire town in attendance. Patterson stood up for Frank, while the general store owner's wife served as Clara's matron of honor. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, and when the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Frank kissed his bride with a tenderness that made several of the ladies in attendance dab at their eyes. The town had organized a celebration in the square afterward, with food and music and dancing. Frank, who had not danced in years, found himself swept up in the joy of the occasion, twirling Clara to the fiddle music with more enthusiasm than skill. And when Tommy Chen, the same boy whose joke about his father being outstanding in his field had caused Frank's first laugh in 3 years, asked why Mr. Sullivan looked so happy, Frank laughed again, free and genuine, and said it was because he was the luckiest man in Arizona territory. Married life suited Frank Sullivan in ways he had never imagined possible. Coming home each evening to the small adobe house to find Clara waiting, to share a meal and conversation and the comfortable intimacy of shared space, felt like a gift he had not earned but was determined to cherish. Clara continued teaching at the school, and Frank continued working at the Patterson Ranch, both of them building their life together with patience and care. They established traditions and rhythms. Sunday walks after church, Saturday morning trips to town for supplies, evenings spent reading aloud to each other by lamplight. Clara's students would sometimes visit, bringing her small gifts of wildflowers or interesting rocks they had found, and Frank found himself becoming a sort of unofficial tutor in practical skills, teaching some of the older boys about animal husbandry and fence mending. In the fall, Clara discovered she was pregnant, and Frank experienced a terror more profound than anything he had felt since Jacob's death. The thought of something happening to Clara, of losing her the way he had lost his brother, threatened to drag him back into the darkness he had fought so hard to escape. Clara, perceptive as always, recognized his fear immediately. She took his hands in hers and made him look at her. "I know you are frightened," she said. "I am frightened too. But Frank, we cannot live our lives in fear of all the things that might go wrong. We have to trust that we will face whatever comes together and that love is worth the risk." Her words, so similar to what she had said to him in the North pasture over a year ago, helped Frank find his center again. He threw himself into preparing for the baby's arrival, building a cradle with his own hands, making sure the house was warm and secure, accompanying Clara to every possible appointment with the doctor in town. In March of 1884, Clara gave birth to a healthy baby boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes. They named him Jacob Francis Sullivan, honoring both Frank's lost brother and their own new beginning. When Frank held his son for the first time, he wept openly, overwhelmed by love and gratitude and a fierce determination to be the best father he could possibly be. Clara, exhausted but radiant, watched her husband cradle their child and smiled. "He would be proud of you, you know, your brother. Proud of the man you have become, the life you have built." "I hope so," Frank said softly, pressing a kiss to his son's downy head. "I am going to tell him all about Uncle Jacob, about what a good man he was. His memory is not going to be just about tragedy. It is going to be about love and laughter, and the kind of person worth remembering." As young Jacob grew, the Sullivan house became filled with the sounds of life. A baby's cries and gurgles, Clara's singing as she worked, Frank's deep voice reading stories or explaining how to identify animal tracks. Frank discovered that fatherhood came naturally to him, that all the protectiveness and care he had once feared to express could be channeled into raising his son with love and wisdom. The town of Agua Caliente prospered alongside the Sullivan family. Clara eventually realized her dream of establishing a lending library, operating out of a corner of the schoolhouse, and Frank became known as a fair and skilled horseman, taking on private clients in addition to his work at the Patterson Ranch. They were respected members of the community, known for their generosity and their genuine care for their neighbors. In the summer of 1885, Clara announced she was pregnant again, and this time, Frank greeted the news with joy rather than fear. Their daughter, Mary Rose Sullivan, was born in February of 1886. A tiny, perfect creature with auburn hair like her mother and a stubborn streak that promised she would never be anything but her own person. Watching Frank with their children never ceased to amaze Clara. The man who had once been so locked in grief and silence was patient and playful, building toy horses and teaching little Jacob his letters, bouncing Mary Rose on his knee while singing off-key lullabies. He laughed freely now, that rusty mechanism having been thoroughly oiled by years of joy and love, and the sound never failed to make Clara's heart swell with happiness. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Frank and Clara stood on the porch of their home as the sun set over the desert, watching Jacob play in the yard while Mary Rose napped inside. Frank's arm was around his wife's shoulders, and she leaned into his solid warmth with a contentment that ran bone deep. "Do you ever think about where we would be if I had not sat down at your table that day in the saloon?" Clara asked, her tone playful but with an undercurrent of genuine curiosity. "I try not to," Frank admitted, "because I suspect I would still be half alive, going through the motions but never really living. You saved me, Clara. You and your terrible jokes and your refusal to let me hide." "That joke was not terrible," Clara protested with mock indignation. "It was clever wordplay, I will have you know." Frank laughed, the sound as natural as breathing now, and pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "It was terrible, but it was also perfect because it reminded me that joy was still possible, that I could still feel something other than pain. You gave me that gift, and I will spend the rest of my life being grateful for it." "You give me gifts every day," Clara said, turning in his arms to face him. "You give me your strength, your loyalty, your love. You gave me these beautiful children and this life we have built together. You showed me what it means to heal, to choose love over fear, to honor the past while embracing the future." They kissed as the desert sunset painted the sky in impossible colors. Two people who had found each other against all odds, who had built something beautiful and lasting in the harsh frontier landscape. And if the ghost of Jacob Sullivan could have seen his brother in that moment, he would have smiled with the knowledge that his death, while tragic, had not destroyed Frank, but had ultimately led him to become a better, fuller version of himself. Years continued to pass in Agua Caliente, marked by the steady rhythm of seasons and the gradual growth of the Sullivan children. Jacob grew into a thoughtful, responsible boy who loved books almost as much as his mother did, while Mary Rose proved to be a fearless child who wanted to do everything her father and older brother did, propriety be damned. In 1888, the Sullivan family welcomed a third child, another son they named Thomas, who came into the world with a sunny disposition that reminded everyone of how Clara had been when she first arrived in town. Frank eventually purchased the Patterson Ranch when the older man decided to retire and move closer to his daughter's family in Texas. It was a decision made carefully, discussed at length with Clara, but one that felt right. Frank hired several ranch hands, including some younger men he personally trained, and he ran the operation with fairness and integrity. The ranch prospered under his management, becoming known throughout the territory for the quality of its horses and cattle. Clara's school continued to grow, eventually requiring an assistant teacher to manage all the students. She took particular pride in the number of her former students who went on to pursue higher education, several with her personal letters of recommendation and support. She had created something lasting in Agua Caliente, a legacy of learning and opportunity that would outlive her own time there. On warm evenings, the Sullivan family could often be found on their porch, Frank and Clara in their rocking chairs while the children played nearby. Frank would tell stories about his own childhood, about Uncle Jacob and the adventures they had shared, and the children would listen with rapt attention. Jacob had become a hero in these tales, not a source of pain, and Frank found that he could speak of his brother with love and laughter now, celebrating the life he had lived rather than dwelling on its tragic end. Sometimes, on particularly quiet nights, Clara would test out new jokes on Frank, trying to get him to laugh with increasingly ridiculous wordplay and puns. More often than not, she succeeded, and the sound of Frank Sullivan's laughter would ring out across the desert, a testament to healing and hope and the power of love to transform even the most wounded heart. Their neighbors would hear that laughter and smile, knowing the story of the quiet cowboy who had not laughed in years, and the brave schoolteacher who had helped him remember what joy felt like. It became a sort of legend in Agua Caliente, passed down through generations, a reminder that it was never too late to heal, never too late to open your heart again, never too late to choose life and love over grief and isolation. As the 1890s approached, Frank Sullivan was a man transformed from the broken, silent cowboy who had ridden into town nearly a decade earlier. He was a husband, a father, a successful rancher, a respected member of the community. But more than any of those titles, he was a man who had learned to live fully again, to embrace joy without guilt, to love without fear. The scars from losing Jacob would never completely disappear, but they had become part of the tapestry of his life rather than the defining feature, woven together with all the beautiful threads that Clara and their children had added. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Frank surprised Clara with a gift he had been working on in secret for months, a hand-bound book containing stories about their life together. There were tales of their first meeting, of their courtship, of the births of their children, all written in Frank's careful, unpracticed hand. The final entry was simply titled "The Joke," and in it, Frank described that moment in the general store when Clara's silly wordplay had cracked open his carefully constructed walls and let the light back in. Clara wept as she read it, her fingers tracing over the words with reverence. "This is beautiful, Frank. I had no idea you could write like this." "I had a good teacher," Frank said, pulling her close. "She taught me that words matter, that stories matter, that holding on to the good memories is just as important as honoring the painful ones." That night, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Frank and Clara sat together on their porch under a canopy of brilliant desert stars. They did not need to speak. Their comfort with each other was such that silence was companionship rather than absence. But eventually, Clara broke the peaceful quiet. "You know what I think about sometimes?" she asked. "What is that?" Frank replied, his thumb stroking gentle circles on the back of her hand. I think about how our lives are made up of these tiny moments that seem insignificant at the time, but turn out to change everything. If I had chosen a different table that day in the saloon, if you had refused to let me sit with you, if I had not told that ridiculous joke about Tommy Chen's father, our entire lives might have been completely different. But they were not, Frank said. You sat at my table, I let you stay. You told your joke and I laughed, and here we are. Here we are, Clara echoed, smiling in the darkness. Happy and whole and together. Happy and whole and together, Frank agreed, and in those words was a world of meaning, a testament to the journey they had traveled from brokenness to healing, from isolation to connection, from grief to joy. The Sullivan family continued to grow and thrive in Agua Caliente for many more years. Jacob eventually became a lawyer, traveling to study in California before returning to practice in the territory. Mary Rose, true to her independent nature, became a doctor, one of the first female physicians in Arizona, and Thomas took over the ranch when Frank was ready to step back from the daily operations. Frank and Clara grew old together in the house where they had raised their family, their love deepening with each passing year until it was as much a part of the landscape as the desert itself. They became the couple that younger people looked to as an example, proof that true love was not just a fairy tale, but a choice made every single day to show up, to be present, to honor and cherish the person you had committed to. When Frank Sullivan was 73 years old, he sat on his porch with Clara beside him, watching the sun set over the same desert that had witnessed their entire life together. His hair was silver now, his hands gnarled with arthritis, but his eyes still lit up when he looked at his wife, and his smile came easily, generously, a gift he had learned to give freely. "What are you thinking about?" Clara asked, her own hair white as snow, her green eyes still bright with curiosity and love. "I was thinking about Jacob," Frank said, his voice reflective. "Both Jacobs, actually, my brother and our son. And about how life has a way of surprising you, of bringing beauty out of tragedy if you are willing to let it. Your brother would be proud," Clara said, squeezing his hand. "Of the man you became, of the family you built, of the life you lived." "I hope so," Frank said. "But mostly, I hope he knows that I never forgot him, that I carried him with me through everything, that his memory was part of what made me the man I needed to be for you and our children." "He knows," Clara said with certainty. "How could he not when you speak of him with such love?" Frank pulled his wife close, breathing in the familiar scent of her, feeling the steady rhythm of her heartbeat against his chest. They sat that way as the stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky. Two people who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances and had built a life that was rich with meaning, deep with love, and filled with the laughter that had once seemed impossible. In the years after Frank's death at the age of 78, Clara would often sit on that same porch and remember. She remembered the silent, broken cowboy who had sat alone at a table in the saloon, pushing everyone away. She remembered the sound of his laughter that first time, rusty and surprised, when she told that silly joke about a rancher being outstanding in his field. She remembered every kiss, every conversation, every moment of joy they had shared across 43 years of marriage. And she would smile, knowing that their story had been exactly what both of them needed it to be. A testament to the healing power of love, the importance of choosing life over fear, and the truth that it is never, ever too late to let yourself feel joy again. The quiet cowboy had not laughed in years, but when he finally did, it opened a door to a life more beautiful than he could have ever imagined. And that laughter echoed through generations, a legacy of hope and healing that would never be forgotten in the small desert town of Agua Caliente, Arizona.